At Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, we value equity, specifically racial equity. As an organization, we're working to become more equitable in all areas of our work. As we move towards racial equity, we are asking our grant recipients to join us in this journey of making Cuyahoga County a more equitable place for all of its residents. We created this video to provide our grant recipients and partners with some definitions for the language that we use within our application and reports, as well as some helpful tips. These definitions and tips were informed by a variety of sources.
White advantage privilege definition. White advantage is the inherent and greater access to power and resources white people have when compared to people of color. People identified as white are dramatically more likely to have benefits in terms of home ownership, access to quality education, and inheritance based on previous generations' access to those privileges of whiteness. Almost no one, white or person of color, is individually asking to be privileged or oppressed. At the same time, understanding white advantage in the context of systemic racism and doing nothing about it, it constitutes colluding in exactly the way the system was set up. People of color ALAANA definition. People of color is used to describe any person who is not considered white. The term encompasses all non-white people, emphasizing common experiences of systemic racism. The term may also be used with other collective categories of people, such as communities of color and artists of color. CAC also uses the acronym ALAANA, which stands for African, African American, Latino, Latinx, Asian and Asian American, Arab, Native American, when speaking about communities of color. Now let's talk about the different dimensions of racism. We can separate the different types of racism into two categories: symptoms/micros, which includes internalized and interpersonal racism, and systems/macros, which includes institutional and structural racism. We will now define all four types. Internalized racism lies within individuals. These are private beliefs about race that resides inside our minds. Some examples of internalized racism include prejudice, xenophobia, internalized oppression and privilege, and biases, conscious and unconscious, about race influenced by the dominant culture. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals. Once we bring our private beliefs about race into our interactions with others, we are now in the interpersonal realm. Some examples of interpersonal racism include public expression of prejudice, hate, biases, and bigotry between individuals. Now let's talk about symptoms and macros. Institutional racism occurs within institutions. It involves discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, and inequitable opportunities and impact based on race. An example of institutional racism in the arts sector is arts institutions that exhibit, curate, program, and lift only Eurocentric work as a sole and singular example of excellence, while neglecting and marginalizing cultural traditions, practice, and productions from other communities. Structural racism is racial bias across institutions and society. It's the cumulative and compound effects of an array of factors that systemically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. An example of structural racism is the racial wealth divide, where white people have many times the wealth of people of color. Results from generation of discrimination and racial inequity. Here are some ways individuals and organizations can combat the different types of racism. The table was provided by Race Forward. We recommend that you pause the video at this time and read each strategy. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit bias influences behaviors in automatic ways. Social conditioning and oppressive norms and culture cause us to link concepts and identities together in a biased way. Some examples include black/criminal, white/innocent, women weak, men strong, etc. Everyone has implicit bias and internalized biases towards women, immigrants, people of color, elderly, youth, etc. Unconscious bias is a default condition of human cognition. Implicit biases are directed against anyone in the outgroup. Implicit biases can change either negatively or positive with exposure, relationships, and learning. To see what biases you might have, you can complete the Implicit Bias Association test managed by the Project Implicit through Harvard University. The test measures your implicit biases through a rapid response testing system. For a link to the test, see our description box. Now let's talk about what equity is and what equity is not. Equity is defined as a fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. Equity is a separate, targeted treatment in order to meet the needs of those marginalized. Equity relates to the strategies that are needed to impact institutional barriers. Equity is a process, a practice, and an outcome. Racial equity is defined as the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. Racial equity involves proactive, targeted, and separate treatment and strategies that name racism and white supremacy explicitly, meets the needs of people of color, eliminate racial barriers and disparities, prioritize process and practice to build towards racial justice, and are just not about numerical or quantitative representation.
Now let's talk about what equity is not. Diversity is not equity. Diversity is defined as the demographic mix of specific collection of people. To be a diverse organization simply means that you have the presence of a different identities throughout your organization. However, an organization can be diverse without being inclusive, and an organization can also be diverse without being equitable. Inclusion is not equity. Inclusion is defined as the degree to which diverse individuals are able to participate fully in the decision-making process with an organization or a group. You can have a diverse team or talent, but that doesn't mean that everyone feels welcome, valued, or is given the opportunity to grow. Inclusion is not a natural consequence of diversity. Equality is not equity. Equality is defined as the state of being equal, the right of a different groups of people to receive the same treatment. Equality aims to promote fairness, but it can only work if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same level of help. We know that not everyone starts at the same place and not everyone has the same needs. Equity appears unfair, but it actively moves everyone closer to success by leveling the playing field. Equality is treating everyone the same. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful. Tokenism is not equity. Tokenism is defined as a practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of equality. Cultural competence is not equity. Cultural competence is defined as the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures.
We define racial justice as the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunity, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. It is not just an absence of discrimination and inequities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures.
This concludes our video. For a list of resources, please see the link in the description box. Thank you for watching.